Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Donald Grodoff, family coach with FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com. In the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast series, I delve into the hidden characteristics of OCD, anxiety, and anxiety disorders. The things that most people don't see, that are behind closed doors and shut within the mind about anxiety. My goal with these podcasts is to bring about awareness of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. Understand that I am not a doctor, therapist, or counselor, and the content, information, resources, and ideas that are talked about and brought up here in these podcasts are things that I have used, discovered, or have been recommended to me, and I always recommend to seek additional professional help in finding solutions for yourself. Thank you for listening and enjoy the podcast. This podcast is out of step with the sequence of numbers because we have a special guest at the second half of this month that talks about ERP therapy. And I wanted you all to understand what ERP was before that interview. So that is why I'm jumped ahead with this particular one for this month. And we'll get back into the pattern next month. Thank you for understanding. This is podcast number 14 called ERP Therapy. Last time we talked about flooding, a type of therapy that, in my opinion, really does not work and you really want to avoid. It's when you're going straight at it and really diving directly into the triggers that trigger somebody's anxiety, and usually going for the biggest ones and just jumping right in, not going fast at it, getting exposed immediately to the trigger, which to me is like just a basic bomb happening for OCD. So today we're going to talk about ERP, exposure and response prevention therapy. And let me read for you the definition off of the IOCDF, International OCD Foundation website, which is, by the way, listed on the website invisiblewheelchair.com. And I'm going to read it from there. This is an excerpt, and it's under the title of What is Exposure and Response Prevention. CBT, better known as Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, also really known in layman's term as talk therapy. CBT refers to a group of similar types of therapies used by mental health therapists for treating psychological disorders, with the most important type of CBT for OCD being exposure and response prevention, or ERP. The exposure in ERP refers to exposing yourself to the thoughts, images, objects, and situations that make you anxious and start your obsessions, while the response prevention part of ERP refers to making a choice not to do the compulsive behavior once the anxiety or obsessions have been triggered. All of this is done under the guidance of a therapist at the beginning, though you will eventually learn to do your own ERP exercises to help manage your symptoms. And by the way, I'll throw a plug in here for myself in this, shameless plug might be, but I also help in coaching that the therapist gets you going. I can coach you along and give you the encouragement and the guidance to make it through that process. So here is my view of what ERP is and how I have held and done it with my OCD kids. It's a methodical, slow, and tedious exposure to the triggers that set off OCD. It is a step-by-step approach. It's time-consuming, but to me it is one of the best treatments for OCD. It starts out slow with either it can go with either your biggest or your simplest trigger. Most of the time, I like to think about it going with the simplest first, so there can be immediate sense of accomplishment by going after the lightest trigger. And by that I mean a trigger. When my daughter and I would work on it, I would ask her, okay, so this object that's really bothering you, on a 1 to 10 scale, how strong does that drive your anxiety? And she would give me a number in between there. So a simple or a light trigger would probably be like a 2 or 3, or somewhere in that range, the lower end of that number. A bigger one would be an 8, 9, or a 10. So what most people I think suggest, and what I think is probably the best, is to start out with those simple ones, the ones that rank at a 2 or 3 or less, because then that one can be easily gotten over. The anxiety is not real strong, so you can knock that anxiety out, and it's an accomplishment. It makes them feel good, like they are able to then do something. So, we take either the simplest or the biggest, but like I say, I suggest the simplest. And you find ways to slowly and simply be around it, touch it, be near it, get acquainted with that trigger. And so the object of it is to kind of desensitize yourself to that trigger, to become more comfortable with the trigger, so future contact with that trigger, whatever it might be, will be easier and less effective, and won't raise anxiety, or at least it won't raise it up high at all. So, and I'll give you, well, first I'd like to read what their way of kind of saying, a way to think of ERP. And I'm going to read this from the IOCD, the International OCD Foundation website. This is under the category Another Way to Think About ERP. And I'm going to read it directly because I think it's kind of fitting and helps to understand it. Think of your anxiety as an alarm system. If an alarm goes off, what does it mean? The alarm is there to get your attention. If an intruder is trying to break into your house, the alarm goes off, wakes you up, gets you to act, to do something, to protect yourself and your family. But what if the alarm system went off when a bird landed on the roof instead? Your body would respond to that alarm the same way it would if there were an actual threat, such as an intruder. OCD takes over your body's alarm system, a system that should be there to protect you. But instead of only warning you of real danger, the alarm system begins to respond to any trigger, no matter how small, as an absolute, terrifying, catastrophic threat. When your anxiety goes off, like the alarm system, it communicates information that you are in danger, rather than, pay attention, you might be in danger. Unfortunately, with OCD, your brain tells you that you are in danger a lot, even in situations where you know that there is a very small likelihood that something bad might happen. This is one of the cruelest parts of this disorder, and that is so true. So what I wanted to give you an idea of a real example, and again I use my daughter because we did a lot of work. We probably did about a year's worth of ERP with her. So with my daughter, as an example, one of her triggers was getting into the car. She couldn't sit in the seats in it, but first off, we couldn't get her into the car to be able to even get to the therapist that we were working with at the time. So the very first thing is she couldn't touch the door handle. And I think I've gone over before as to what that triggers about. I mean, somebody may have touched it that had done something that really triggers her, and so she would not touch it. She wouldn't really touch any doorknobs because so many people could have touched it. But so what we had to do, first of all, understand that she was involved with most of the decisions on how to plan this out. She was hesitant at first, so a lot of this planning we had to do initially without her. But once she started getting into it, she would help us decide what the different steps were to get to, overcoming these triggers. But let's go back to the car, the door handle. So what we had to do first with her was understand what the level of it was, and then we had to take a picture of the door handle and bring it in. She was inside, she wasn't near the car or outside or anything like that. She had to look at that picture of that door handle, and with her it would trigger her anxiety. It would start raising up her anxiety. She'd get really anxious looking at it. But she had to sit and look at that picture and go through the anxiety till it came down. And we had to do that multiple times. We usually did it twice a day. We would work on our homework, as we called it, our exposures. Um, and we did a lot of her, at least initially, would take 3 to 4, maybe even a week for her to really get over just one step of it. So from the pictures, once she could look at that picture and it didn't raise anxiety, or at least didn't raise it up into a high level, we were able to move on to the next step. And in her case, the next step would be stepping or looking through the door at the car door. So she was still a distance, she was still inside, had to go through the same thing, get through the anxiety of it, all of that. And in our process, I use tapping a lot. I use surrogate tapping on me, and as she progressed later on, she would do the tapping herself. But the tapping would help bring down the anxiety even faster. So then the next step was once she was able to look through the door to the car to the door handle, and without anxiety, then she would take the next step, which was she stepped outside and looked across at the door. And we had to go through the same process there till the anxiety went down. Then she had to step closer. And I don't remember how many feet, but there was we would just step till she said, I just can't take it anymore, and we'd stop. And then she would sit there and go through that a couple of days on that or whatever it took to get down in that anxiety, step closer and closer until she was right up against the door, not touching it at first, but looking at it. And again, same process till it got down. Then she would put the tip of her finger, the very least amount she could, against the door handle, and that would drive her into high anxiety. And we had to sit there and have her hold on to it till that anxiety went down. And then, that one especially took a while. I think that took probably 4 or 5 days at least to get past that. And then she had to put 2 fingers on, then 3 fingers on, then 4, then possibly touching with the top of all of her fingers or something like that, and then possibly grabbing it. And again, step by step, slow and methodical, encouraging her all the way, not condemning her, but encouraging her all the way until she was able to touch the door and then finally open the door. And a lot of times, as the more we got through different triggers, as we got to 3 or 4 triggers had been passed, then a lot of times I could encourage her to go, I think you could really do this next step now. And she would go, oh, all right. And she would do whatever the next big step was. Now, you have to be very careful, because I'll tell you what can happen if you try to rush this. And that we talked about, I think, in the flooding, is you can't jump from, her looking at the picture to touching the door. That's too dramatic, too bold, too strong, and can actually reverse the whole process. And trust me, I've done that. We were doing so good, and I jumped her too far. We were just having a good day, and it was really going well, and she was really happy and enthusiastic about doing it, which was not totally unusual, but it was. But this one day, we went too far. I stepped her right to a certain point that was not good, and it threw us back months of therapy, months of this ERP, and we kind of had to start all over again. So I warn you very heavily, don't go too fast or too heavy with this, at one time. So you have to kind of plot it out. And I in coaching, I help people to plot out steps, goals, things like that they can do to be able to get this done properly. You want to encourage them during the losses, because you'll make two steps forward and then you'll make a step backwards. And sometimes you'll make two steps forward and two steps back. But you got to encourage those losses, saying, I know you can do this, and we'll just keep trying. We'll just keep working on it. And you celebrate the wins. You celebrate when they really, and give them let them celebrate too. Make sure they're celebrating. So the principle behind it is to sit through the anxiety until you're able to see or touch the trigger with no to little anxiety. And each step you sit through the anxiety till you get to the other side of it. And again, I use EFT, the tapping process I use, to help speed that reduction of anxiety. And the more you did that, the less anxiety. And just as a note, and I'm not going to go into heavy about medication, but a lot of times the medication that's used, I think, the most in this is the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And I'll kind of explain that real quickly as what that does. In OCD, and here again, I am not a doctor, not a therapist, but I'm going to explain this in the real layman's terms that I kind of understand it in. And I think I'm pretty close with this in understanding, but when in the brain of an OCD person, the neural pathways talk to each other. They're firing messages back and forth to each other. In a person with OCD's brain, the messages are being sent out, but coming back like backwash, which is not proper. And that's where you get the loop of talking. We talk because the part of this does have some talk to it, but a lot of people talk about CBT, and therapists, I think, that I've seen that don't really understand OCD try to do CBT. I'm sorry, therapists that don't understand OCD tend to want to talk about CBT, and it has to be done very carefully because, and most times, I think there's even studies, it talks about it on the IOCD Foundation site, that there's actually been studies that show that it really is not effective and actually can, kind of backfire because think about it, you've got this loop of messages that go on in the head that just get worse and worse and worse. My daughters went crazy and would keep her mind so filled with negative thoughts and bad thoughts that if you're using talk therapy to get through this, that can, a lot of times what that can do is fire those loops, get those messages going and spiral into loops of messages that aren't good. So I would be cautious. Like I said, I feel like ERP therapy is one of the best therapies there are. And of course, like I said, I talk about, I think in one of the other ones I talked about the range of therapies there are. And like EFT and the Alpha Stim that I work with, hypnotherapy, all of that is good stuff that really supplements well with ERP. So I'm not downing the other ones. I'm just saying I think it's almost a must that ERP should be in the plan for anybody with OCD. So I hope this has helped, and I look forward to our next talk. You have a good day. Thank you. That concludes this podcast. Please leave me a comment or question below. That gives me good direction where to go on future podcasts. I would love to hear your invisible wheelchair stories if you're willing to share it. If you would, go to invisiblewheelchair.com and click on Tell Your Story. I want to remind you that OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is treatable, and I can help you get past OCD. So if you have heard this podcast and others, and you feel like you need further assistance and would like to spend some time with me working through any issues you have, then feel free to book a session at focusedhealthyfamily.com or familyocd.com, or you can call me at 704-562-1630. I also offer $85 off initial discovery session if you mention that you heard it on this podcast. Finally, don't forget that there is a tapping recording that coincides with this podcast you may want to take advantage of. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast and will join me for the next one. Remember to keep tapping, talking, and transcending your life to new heights. Thank you, and have a great day.